do know, obviously, we talk about it all the time on CNBC Africa, the shifting center of gravity to the emerging markets and the growing prominence of countries like China, Brazil, Russia, India, and now South Africa and Africa in itself. How realistic is this whole idea of a shift? To what extent do these countries now catalyze global growth?
Well, we are observing that in the last period of time, 70% of the growth in the world has been concentrated in these countries. Obviously, we should add some others, such as Vietnam, such as Korea, obviously Colombia, and many others. But if we take this ensemble of developing countries, they are performing extremely well. Now, we are observing mid-term trends. So what we are doing are hypotheses. But accordingly, with our hypothesis, if at present 40% of the global GDP is produced in this country, in 2030, we estimate that the 60% will be produced here. There is a shift in wealth then.
Shift in wealth, technically speaking, in GDP terms and in growth terms. But what does it mean for the ordinary person? We know that in recent years, poverty in some of these markets has been reduced by 1/4, but some of the most vulnerable citizens in the world continue to live in these countries.
You are totally right. First of all, it's obviously very important that extreme poverty has been reduced. And obviously, economic development helps to get to these results. But can we really say that now these people have moved out from extreme poverty in a sustainable way? Aren't they vulnerable, as you say? We have done a specific study in all South American countries recently, looking at what happened to these people that left extreme poverty. Some newspaper or magazine called them middle class. Are they a real middle class?
Right.
Well, when you say middle class, you think to nuclear family, where there is one car, maybe two, a dog, maybe two, consumer goods, people have formal training, the children will have better formal training than the parents. Is it the case? No, unfortunately not. These people that leave poverty very often work in informal economy, don't have a car, don't have necessarily formal education.
Right.
It's most likely that the children will be analphabet with a university title. Therefore, we are observing a phenomena, but government has to take into account measures that help transforming this middle sector of the income distribution in a real middle class.
Let's talk about where the power and the wealth is retained. In as much as we're seeing more capital inflows into emerging markets, the investors are primarily foreigners from established traditional Western economies, Europe and the United States, institutional investors, retail investors. And so the assets in these emerging markets are largely owned not by the indigenous people, but again by foreigners from these traditionally wealthy countries. So can we really talk about a shift in wealth?
Well, what you are presenting now is obviously true, but it's part of the true. We have also to recognize that there are a series of activities and new markets that have been opened by local population, and also the incoming foreign direct investment help developing subcontractors and workaround. So the two things are interlinked. However, yes, you're right. In many cases, we are confronted with flows of capital, and sometimes they are so quick and so concentrated in raw materials that risk to increase the price of raw materials. We are observing it with consequences on the rest of the economy that economists like me used to call the Dutch disease. In other terms, prices rises, and the other industries that are not in this driving sector will suffer because they cannot pay the same level of wages or not deal with the same rate of interest. Therefore, there is an issue with the incoming capitals, and probably we have to think about measures such in Chile or in Norway where sovereign health funds are being created.
Within this tag, Mario, it's also this idea of the center of gravity shifting. With the first signs of inflation in China, as we're currently seeing, there's been a sell-off in bonds to emerging markets. I think the figure is something like 3.5 billion that's just left in the last 2-3 days alone, and a major sell-off of South African bonds since the start of the year. And you know, as investors look for yield, they can also, at a whim, move away back into these conventional markets that we're talking about. So again, it raises this question of where the power really lies.
Yeah, I think that you are touching another aspect of the previous question. It is very important that now we figure out mechanisms through social security, for example, or a complete social protection system that allow local people to build savings and to build perspective that are more mid-term perspective, so to avoid that if this inflows goes away, then everything will fall down, and this vulnerability will translate into a crash or a reduction of capacities. In other terms, we need to build more stable internal demand. That's a fact. But actually, the government of China is moving in this direction. All the perspective called building a more harmonious society are defining exactly these efforts. So government, I think, are aware of this risk and are doing the best to move in a positive direction.
Okay, let's look past the negativity that I've portrayed and some of the more useful aspects of the shift in global wealth. I said earlier on, speaking to Ambassador Stith, that China has become the largest investor in Africa, the largest trading partner for many African states. We're seeing more and more South-South cooperation and a rotation of capital within the South. Are African countries doing enough to maximize these new relationships?
Obviously, this relationship can always be improved. But let's first recognize that the diversification of a relationship helps. Let me take an example elsewhere. In Latin America, the recovery from the crisis was extremely quick. And one of the reasons is the diversification in partner. So this helps. And I am also persuaded that investment from China and other countries are capable to create a certain critical mass on which development can be further improved. Yeah, that is there. Now, what can be done in order to improve further? Obviously, the relationship with the partners can be object of negotiation, and it would be important to think also to transfer of skills and not only to creation of jobs. And I think that there are possibilities and schemes that move in this direction.
The impact of the so-called austerity measures in Europe at the moment and what that could do for this idea of shifting wealth, because I've talked about the investment nexus and that right now we're still very much an interdependent world where growth and sustained growth in emerging markets does require to some extent the participation of investors, donors, whatever, from Europe and the United States.
No doubt that the rhythm of growth in Europe has been reduced and will remain reduced for a while. As such, we cannot necessarily expect a strong locomotive to come from that perspective. It's either the reverse. It's, I think, the reverse. And as a consequence, we have to emphasize South-South relationship as a good track to build alternative to the locomotive of the past.
Going forward, we've spoken about the fact that by 2030, if all is well, some of these emerging markets will account for 60% of global GDP.
Right.
Where does Africa fit, I think, within this continuum? That's the first one, just your perspective. And what do we need to do better? We're told we need to reinvigorate our capital markets. We need to promote local investment. You've spoken about the need to improve on social systems. Yes.
Let me say that Africa, first of all, and in particular South Africa, is obviously part of the BRICS. And the BRICS are important locomotive in this scenario. I think that Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, and China all together are providing perspectives that are encouraging for the world economy. So in this respect, fine. How further we can unleash the potential for growth in countries like South Africa or other African countries? I think that there are a series of priorities. First of all, infrastructure is, of course, a priority. Infrastructure requires foreign direct investment or private investment, but not only. It requires also increasing the capacity in the public administration to deal with the identification of demand for infrastructure, the identification of priorities, how to do good public-private partnership, public procurement, monitoring, relationship between level of government. All these things can be further developed, and I think will help the growth.
Competition, I mean, we talk about partnership with Asia and Africa, Africa and Latin America. But in Africa, we've still got people coming out of poverty, as we spoke about. We've got skills issues, labor, the differentials between what African labor can offer, growth prospects in terms of the manufacturing cycle, what Asian labor can offer are two very different pictures. And there is a sense that with production systems changing and shifting, we're still on the back foot in Africa if we're competing with labor in Asia, in Latin America, wages and skills.
You're right, because in certain cases GDP is not a growth, it's not necessarily associated with productivity improvements. Therefore, productivity is an issue, is a target, and what to do. One is to improve human capital, and therefore education and everything that can be created around education will help. But secondly, also we have to think about innovation, innovating in product, innovating in processes. These are fields in which Africa, as well as Latin America, is not at the same rhythm than the growth that have been capable to show.